Well, this week I spent a little time at my desk reacquainting myself with our diocesan policies for keeping everybody safe. And the various requirements that our larger church institutional structure makes of us to carry out background checks on leaders and volunteers in various roles, and to ensure that they participate in online training modules for the prevention of child abuse and sexual harassment and the exploitation of vulnerable elders and all that kind of nasty stuff. Because, we're sort of getting going again after the COVID pandemic, and we're having Sunday school again, and we're sending people out to bring communion to shut-ins and those in care facilities, and all those kinds of activities are resuming where, sad to say, nasty things can happen. If you aren't aware of who's here, and we aren't all keeping in mind what one needs to do and what we all need to do together to ensure that none of us starts down even a little bit down the slippery slope that can lead to such abuses that, as we all know, are rife everywhere in our society, and the church is not somehow miraculously spared by God from having such things happen in it. Now, of course, all of this is a little bit onerous and even expensive because the background checks aren't free. Connie? Yeah. I'm talking to the treasurer because she's our resident deficit hawk. But obviously it's very important. And yet its importance is relative. Because if the aim is to have not just a community where, the worst sorts of things don't happen, but one where people of all ages and conditions and abilities and backgrounds can truly flourish, can live together in harmony with one another, have their rights and their dignity respected, develop their God-given gifts, and be celebrated and welcomed and enjoy their belovedness, then simply following the guidelines laid down by the diocese is not sufficient. And that's sort of what our readings today are about. How do you actually create a community that is blessed by God, where all the people who belong to it are free and safe and respected and beloved, and we relate to one another as if that were the case? Well, the ancient Hebrews were of the opinion that they had been given a law for this purpose, a law that was revealed to them by their great prophet Moses as they were on their way out of slavery in Egypt on a long journey through the wilderness to the land that had been promised to them, to their ancestors on their behalf. a land where they would live together in covenant with one another and with God, and the way that they could ensure that their lives would indeed have this character, this special character of justice and equality and peaceableness and respect for one another and undying gratitude to the God who had liberated them and given them the inestimable gift of this beautiful, broad land flowing with milk and honey, was this law of surpassing justice and wisdom that had been revealed to them by the same God who created the universe and set it in order. The same God who had called their ancestor Abraham to leave behind his home in Mesopotamia and make the journey to the land of Canaan, trusting that even though he was childless, God would provide for him offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky, and would settle them there on that land to dwell together in peace. And they screwed it up. So the book of Deuteronomy, for example, Deuteronomy is from a Greek word that means the second law, because, so the story goes, after these 40 years of journeying through the wilderness, they were finally ready to go across the River Jordan into that land and start, setting things up according to the law that Moses had brought down from the top of the Mount Sinai for them. But they'd already screwed up so many times that the law had to be repeated. Moses had to stand there with the Israelites on the brink of entering the land and kind of rehearse the whole thing again from the top. And that's the literary context, and it's interesting to note that throughout the subsequent biblical history, this process of renewing the covenant by remembering the law happens over and over again. Because just because you have the best law in the whole world, the wisest, the most just, the most compassionate, the one that is most conducive to living together in peace and harmony, doesn't mean you're going to keep it or succeed in carrying it out. So the final form of the book of Deuteronomy, it's very clear, was set down in exile in Babylon, where, from the vantage point of having screwed up so badly that they lost just about everything, the Israelites lost their beautiful temple, they lost their glorious city of Jerusalem, they lost their promised land of the covenant, they lost their freedom, they came pretty darn close to losing their identity as a people and just being swallowed up as another bunch of slaves of the Babylonian Empire. But the one thing they still had, even though they couldn't carry it out to perfection because they no longer had a temple in which to carry out their sacrifices, they no longer had a land from which to gather the first fruits and take them to that temple, but they still had their law. And they had the essence of that law. which was to love God and to keep his commandments. And it was in that they invested all their hope for renewing their relationship with God and with each other, and perhaps someday returning home and getting a chance to start all over again. So fast forward to sometime in the last quarter of the first century of the Common Era, and you've got this little group of people living, we're not sure exactly where, somewhere perhaps in Syria, and maybe in the city of Antioch. This strange little community of people who believe that a Jewish rabbi who was put to death on a cross some 40 or 50 years before, and who, even more strangely, had started to attract some adherents, people who wanted to belong to their community, who are not even Jewish, who were Gentiles, and yet who wanted with all their heart and soul and mind to love and to worship the God of Israel. Well, this little group of people who gave us the Gospel of Matthew declared that this Jesus, who had died indeed, but also had been raised again by God to life, raised by the God of life to be the source of life to all who put their trust and faith in him, that he was revealed to them as the giver of the law, the renewer of the covenant, the new and superior interpreter of the law of Moses, a law which, of course, they could not observe in its completeness because, once again, Jerusalem had been destroyed, this time by the Romans. The temple had been sacked and burned, and its treasures carried off in triumph to be paraded through the streets of Rome. The people of Israel were once again subjugated to a foreign empire. And that this little group of people, following their Lord, not Caesar, but Jesus, said this law still applies to us. This law that shows us how, in spite of all that, God still cares for us, and God still shows us a way to live, a way of life. So if you look at those pieces of the law that are contained in this little section of the 5th chapter of Matthew that we heard today, it's interestingly selective. There's nothing in there about the purity of laws that make someone qualified to participate in the cult of God. Nothing in there about the dietary laws. Nothing in there about the Sabbath. Just a few sort of cherry-picked little pieces that have everything to do with how this little community is going to stick together. How they're going to keep from tearing each other apart under the pressure of their marginalized little existence in a world that thinks basically that they're wrong about everything. Under the pressure of persecution, under the pressure of trying to fit together these two communities of people that come from entirely different cultures and religious orientations, these Jews and Gentiles. How are they going to keep it together? Because they're keeping it together, as far as they're concerned, is the hope for the world. Jesus is the hope for the world. And if the people who believe in him can't keep it together, then forget about it. Just forget about it. All that bad stuff that happens, all the abuse, all the exploitation, all the mistreatment, all the enslavement, all the debts that never get canceled, all the insatiable appetite for war and conquest and enslaving other people, that's never going to change unless it's true that God raised Jesus from the dead and that he is the Messiah sent by God to save everyone. But if we can't keep it together, well, you might as well just go to that place. It's translated hell in our translation, but actually it's not some supernatural realm of eternal punishment invented by God. It's a place called Gehenna, right outside Jerusalem. It used to be called Hinnom, and that is where during those bad days when the Israelites weren't following God's law, they used to go out and sacrifice their children. And then, when they woke up and realized that this was not the way, they turned it into a garbage dump. It was Jerusalem's garbage dump, and it was continually burning and smoldering. And Jesus says, that is a place that looks like death. That is a world where death reigns supreme and its power is never broken. But there's another possibility. You heard, don't kill. Well, that seems like it should be simple enough, right? Well, it turns out it's not that simple. And the slippery slope that leads to people killing each other is one we know very well. You fool! Moron, you stupid person! That's how it starts. You heard that you shouldn't commit adultery. Yeah, okay, well, I suppose I can manage that one. Well, you know how the slippery slope to that starts? Well, you just start looking at people, objectifying them as sex objects, and one thing leads to another. You try to convince somebody that what you're saying is really important and they should really trust you and believe what you're saying, and so you swear up and down on your father's grave or your children's hair or God or Jerusalem or whatever, and just tell the truth and people will believe you. These sayings of Jesus are hard for us because we are used to hearing them as spoken authoritatively, as a church that exercises a lot of power for the purposes of social control. But it might help us to remember their origins in this little community of the Gospel of Matthew, this little powerless, marginal, persecuted, outcast, confused, struggling, fearful little community, doing its best to stick together, to love each other, to forgive each other, to hold in and among themselves the almost incomprehensible hope that a crucified Messiah was worthy of all their faith and trust and worship and love. And that if they could just hold on to that together and keep acting as if it were true, if they could just keep forgiving each other for his sake, keep being kind to one another and extending themselves to one another for his sake, if they could just exercise some self-control. I mean, no one's literally going to tear out their eye and throw it away. No one's literally going to cut off their hand and toss it to the curb. Because, come on, your eye doesn't cause you to sin. But someone does. You know who it is. So, can we just exercise that little degree of self-control that enables us to, when we catch ourselves getting angry at that person over there, starting to dehumanize them even just a little bit in our minds. We start dehumanizing that really attractive person over there and kind of, lusting after them a little bit. Can we catch ourselves and just cut that off before it really gets a chance to get going for the sake of Jesus? Maybe we can keep it together. Maybe we can extend a little bit of hope for the whole world